Snowflakes drifted like torn paper over the Missouri plains that winter of 1944. The U.S. Army camp stood in silence, its fences silvered with frost, its wooden towers creaking softly in the wind. Inside, German prisoners shuffled in thin coats, their breaths rising like ghosts against the dawn. The war had swallowed their homeland, and now it had spat them out on American soil, half-starved, humiliated, and stunned to find that captivity could smell faintly of coffee and cornbread. When the trucks arrived that morning, carrying a new group of female prisoners, nurses, typists, and auxiliaries from captured units, few looked up. The men in the camp had already seen enough broken faces to last a lifetime. But these women were different. Pale, hollow-eyed, uniforms torn and muddy, they stepped down into the snow like specters from a burned-out Europe. The Americans watched in uneasy silence. Even the guards, hardened from years of war, didn't speak. Except for one. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of worn copper and a single feather stitched into his coat collar. His name tag read Corporal Yazzie, a Navajo soldier who'd fought with the code talkers in the Pacific before being reassigned as a camp interpreter. The other guards called him Chief, half in jest, half in awe. That morning, when one of the women stumbled and fell to her knees, he broke ranks, stepped forward, and offered his hand. She hesitated, eyes darting between his brown face and the gleam of his belt buckle that bore the eagle of the United States. In her mind, all the war's propaganda screamed at once. Monsters, savages, enemies. Yet his hand stayed open, steady, patient as stone. She took it. In that small moment, something shifted, an invisible fault line between enemy and human. The guards led the women toward the barracks. Inside, steam curled up from tin pots on stoves, carrying the scent of boiled potatoes and soap. That smell alone broke a few of them. 4 months, they had lived in cellars and trenches, wearing the same clothes, unable to wash. A Red Cross officer recorded one of them whispering, "It smells like civilization." The next morning, Yazzie appeared again, this time carrying a crate. Inside were bars of pale yellow soap, rough-hewn and stamped U.S. Army supply. He placed one on the edge of each bunk. The women stared as if they were gifts from heaven, or perhaps traps. One of them, Elsa, 26, a nurse from Bremen, picked hers up gingerly and sniffed it. It smelled faintly of lemon and lye. Her hands trembled. He noticed. "It's just soap," Yazzie said quietly, his English clipped but warm. Elsa blinked. "For us. For everyone," he answered. That was when she began to cry, soundless at first, then in gasps that echoed off the wooden walls. She pressed the bar to her face, tears soaking into its smoothness. Around her, others began to weep too, as though that simple object, the right to be clean, was more mercy than they could bear. Yazzie said nothing. He simply stood there, the crate empty in his hands, watching these women rediscover the idea of dignity. Later, when another guard joked that they looked like schoolgirls with Christmas gifts, Yazzie only replied, "A clean heart starts with clean hands." The irony wasn't lost on him. His own grandparents had been forced into government schools where soap was used not to cleanse but to erase, to wash out their language, their culture. Yet here he was, handing it to the enemy as a blessing. War, he thought, made strange circles. Over the next weeks, the camp transformed in small, invisible ways. The laundry line behind the barracks filled with dresses and underclothes drying in the winter wind. The women began brushing their hair again, trading songs from home for tins of coffee. Elsa, who had once tended dying soldiers on the Eastern Front, now mended torn blankets and smiled when Yazzie passed by. He spoke little, but when he did, his words landed like steady drumbeats, measured, rhythmic, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, he caught her humming near the pump. "What song is that?" he asked. "It's German," she said shyly. "About spring." He nodded, filling a bucket with water. "Spring comes even to prisoners," he said. "Snow doesn't last forever." She didn't know what to say to that. Her English was still fragile, but his tone carried something stronger than language, a belief that survival was not victory, but grace. By February, the women were healthier. The U.S. Army diet of bread, beans, and milk restored color to their faces. When a military chaplain visited, he wrote in his journal, They are treated almost like refugees, not enemies. It was not compassion the world expected in wartime, but America's camps had their own strange order, humane, efficient, quietly moral. Still, whispers traveled through the fence. Some German men across the compound called the women traitors for smiling at the guards. They spat insults through the wire, accusing them of forgetting their homeland. Elsa didn't answer. One evening, she saw Yazzie fixing a broken fence post and asked softly, "Do you ever hate us?" He paused, resting his hands on the wood. "Hate is a heavy thing to carry through snow," he said. "It melts slow." That night, she wrote in her diary, later discovered in a German archive, "The Indian Guard does not shout. He moves like someone who belongs to the earth. I think he knows something about pain that we do not." As winter deepened, the snow turned the camp into a quiet world of white and smoke. Each morning, the prisoners marched to the worksheds, and each evening, the same soap lay waiting by their wash basins, softening, shrinking, yet never quite disappearing. To the women, it became a kind of relic, a reminder that even in war, gentleness could survive. But outside those fences, the world was still burning. News trickled in, cities bombed, armies collapsing, civilians starving. One morning, as the radio crackled with reports from Europe, Elsa froze mid-step. Her hometown had been destroyed. Yazzie saw her standing in the snow, shoulders shaking, the bar of soap clutched tight in her hand. He walked up slowly, not speaking, just standing beside her. Snowflakes landed on his hair, melted, and ran down his cheek like tears. Finally, he said, "You can't wash away all sorrow. But you can start with one small thing." She looked up, eyes red but alive. "Like what?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another bar of soap, fresh and used, still warm from his hand. "This," he said simply. "It's for when you go home." Elsa stared at it as if it were the most impossible gift in the world. In that moment, she realized something quietly devastating. Her captor had given her more dignity than her own army ever had. The wind howled across the camp, shaking the tin roofs. Somewhere beyond the wire, the sound of distant laughter floated from the kitchen, a soldier joking about the cleanest prisoners in America. But inside that moment, nothing felt light. Elsa closed her fingers around the soap, as though holding a fragile truth. And though she didn't know it yet, that small bar would follow her across the ocean, through the ruins of Germany, and into a future she could barely imagine. For now, it was only a symbol, one she would never forget. Because sometimes, mercy comes wrapped not in silk or gold, but in the scent of soap, carried on the wind over snow. At sunrise, the camp smelled of bread. It was a strange, almost tender scent to find behind barbed wire, a smell that didn't belong to war at all. The women woke to it every morning now, that slow, golden perfume drifting from the mess hall where flour met fire. Sometimes it was cornbread, sometimes biscuits, and sometimes plain white loaves baked by the same soldiers who once aimed rifles at them. In the first weeks, the German women thought it was a trick, a way to lure them into complacency. But the bread kept coming, warm and soft, with a smear of butter that melted on the tongue and undid months of hunger in one bite. Life inside the camp had begun to shift. The guards spoke less like wardens and more like neighbors. The once stiff salutes had become nods, half-smiles, small gestures of human rhythm. The barracks that had smelled of rust and damp now carried the mingled aromas of soap, starch, and baking yeast. Even the wind, which used to whistle through the cracks with a mournful tone, now seemed softer, carrying laughter from the kitchen. Elsa, the nurse from Bremen, had started volunteering there. It began by accident, a dropped pan, a shout in English, her instinct to help. When she reached to lift it, Yazzie, the Navajo corporal, saw the reflex and told the sergeant, "Let her stay." Within a week, she was kneading dough beside American cooks, her pale hands dusted white with flour. At first, the language barrier made the kitchen sound like a storm, English orders colliding with German murmurs, but eventually, gestures replaced words. A nod for salt, a raised brow for sugar. Sometimes they even sang old folk tunes, one side humming, the other side laughing at the tune's strange cousin in a foreign tongue. But not everyone approved of this peace. Some American guards muttered that the prisoners were too comfortable, that the war outside still raged. One of them, a young corporal from Kansas, spat near the kitchen door one morning and said, "They bake like housewives while our boys die in the Ardennes." Yazzie didn't answer him. He simply kept stirring a pot of cornmeal and said, "That's how you end wars, one loaf at a time." The other man scoffed, but later, even he took a piece of cornbread when no one was watching. Inside the camp, bread became more than food, it became language. Each loaf was an act of truce. When the women broke it and shared it with the guards, there was a silence afterward, almost sacred. One woman, a former secretary named Marta, said in a letter home, "I think this is how forgiveness smells." The Red Cross inspector who visited in spring noted it too. His report read, "Morale in this camp is unusually high. Prisoners appear healthier, even cheerful." One woman was seen teaching embroidery to an American nurse. The file ended with an understated line, "The exchange of kindness seems mutual." Still, the world beyond those fences was collapsing. News reached the camp in bits and fragments. Dresden in ashes. Berlin encircled. Families scattered. The women read the updates in stunned silence, their hands still dusted with flour, their eyes hollowing again. Some refused to eat for days. Elsa nearly fainted one morning after hearing her city had fallen. Yazzie found her sitting alone behind the barracks, staring at the snowmelt running in narrow channels through the dirt. "You shouldn't stop eating," he said quietly. "Bread remembers the hands that made it." She looked up, weary. "Then it remembers too much sorrow." He crouched beside her. "Where I come from, we break bread to thank the earth, even when it's cruel. That way, it knows we still belong to it." Her mouth quivered. "In Germany, we prayed before bread too. But we prayed to the flag." Yazzie looked away, the shadow of a smile touching his face. "Flags don't feed you. The earth does." That day, she returned to the kitchen. The next loaf she baked came out misshapen, lopsided, but golden. She split it in half and left one piece on the counter for him. He didn't thank her, he just nodded once, as if the gesture itself was already enough. By April, the camp's rhythm had become almost absurdly domestic. Women mended uniforms, swept paths, grew vegetables in small plots fenced with scrap wood. Some of the American nurses began trading recipes for German pastries. One even attempted to make strudel, though the result was more glue than dessert. The laughter that followed felt like rebellion itself. But under that surface calm ran a tension too fine to name. Everyone knew the war was ending. And with its end came a question heavier than any ration box. What would happen to kindness when peace returned? Would it survive the train ride home, the ruined cities, the hunger waiting across the ocean? One afternoon, as the ovens glowed and dough rose in the warmth, a rumor spread. A transport order had arrived. The women were to be sent east, back to Europe, within the month. The news hit the kitchen like a dropped plate. Flour hung in the air, a silent snowstorm. Some cheered at the thought of going home, others looked terrified. Elsa felt neither. She only stared at the cooling rack where the loaves rested, their crusts cracking gently as if whispering secrets to the air. The word didn't mean what it once had. She thought of the man who gave her soap, of the bread she baked with her enemies, of the fence that divided them yet somehow felt safer than the ruins awaiting her. That night, the women gathered by the fire pit. Someone played a harmonica. Someone else started humming a lullaby. When Yazzie passed by, Elsa called out, "Will we ever see this place again?" He paused, eyes reflecting the flames. "You'll see it," he said, "in the way you treat strangers." The words lingered long after he left. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night like tiny shooting stars. Behind them, the kitchen's chimney smoked gently, carrying the scent of bread into the cold air. Sweet, impossible, unforgettable. Later, when Elsa lay in her bunk, she wrote one last note in her diary. Today the camp smelled like home, though no one knew whose home it was. She tucked the page beneath her pillow and listened to the hum of distant trains preparing to take them away. In the morning, she would wake before dawn, and the smell of bread would greet her one last time. The guards would line up, the trucks would roll in, and somewhere in that frozen distance, the echo of ovens and laughter would fade into history. But for now, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of yeast, soap, and wood smoke filling her chest, and whispered a prayer not to God or country, but to the simple, invisible miracle of warmth shared among enemies. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and slow, covering the footprints between barracks and kitchen. And when the first flake landed on her window ledge, it melted into a single shining drop, the color of bread crust. When the spring thaw came, the camp turned into a sea of mud. The snow that had buried the fences now melted into rivers that ran through the barracks, swallowing boots and soaking the hems of dresses. The German women complained at first, then laughed, then simply gave up trying to stay dry. But one man didn't seem to mind the flood at all. Corporal Yazzie called it the earth breathing again. Every morning, before the sun rose, he walked to the edge of the compound where a rusted pipe trickled runoff from the hills. There, with a tin bucket and a shovel, he began digging shallow trenches, guiding the water toward the washhouse. The guards joked that he was building a moat. But to the women, it felt like a miracle, a man who could command water in a place built for confinement. One morning, Elsa followed him. She stood at a distance, her skirt splattered with mud, watching as he crouched low, sculpting the tiny channel with bare hands. The water glimmered in the dawn light, moving slow and sure. "Why do you do this?" she asked finally. He looked up, his breath visible in the chill air. "Where I'm from, rivers are sacred. They remember what people forget." She frowned, puzzled. "And what do they remember?" "That nothing stays still forever," he said. It was a strange kind of wisdom, the kind that didn't sound like advice until much later. By noon, the trench had reached the laundry hut. The women gathered around as the first stream trickled in, clear as glass. They dipped their hands in it, gasping at the cold, laughing as though Yazzie had brought a piece of another world into theirs. From that day on, they called him Der Flussmann, the riverman. And somehow, that name fit him better than any rank or title. He moved like water, quietly, persistently, carving through the hard places. As the weather warmed, the camp changed again. The women began washing more than their clothes. They washed their hair, their faces, even their shoes. The sight of them gathered around the troughs, sunlight catching on wet skin and dripping curls, made the camp feel less like a prison and more like a village caught between two forgotten countries. Yazzie repaired the pump, patched leaks, and sometimes filled extra buckets for the older women who couldn't carry theirs. Elsa noticed how he never rushed, never raised his voice. When the guards barked orders, he spoke softly, and people obeyed anyway. It wasn't authority that made them listen, it was presence. He had the calm of someone who understood suffering not as punishment, but as weather. One afternoon, she offered to help him carry the water pails. Her hands were raw and red from soap, but she insisted. Together they walked through the mud, two silhouettes against the white glare of spring. "After a while," she said quietly, "you don't hate us." He didn't answer right away. "I hate the war," he said finally. "That's enough work for one man." She nodded, unsure whether to thank him or apologize. Neither felt right. Later that week, a shipment of Red Cross supplies arrived. Boxes of bandages, soap, fabric, and tin basins. The camp commander, a stiff man from Ohio, told Yazzie to distribute them. He did, but in his own way. Instead of handing out the items in silence, he explained each one like a teacher introducing tools of healing. "This," he said, holding a bar of soap, "is not a gift. It's a reminder." Elsa, watching from the back, felt something twist inside her. He spoke to them not as enemies or charity cases, but as people capable of rebuilding. That day, she saw several women cry, not from shame, but from the sudden recognition that someone believed they could be whole again. In the evenings, Yazzie sometimes told stories to the younger guards. They would sit near the fence, passing a tin cup of coffee, while the prisoners inside listened through the slats. His stories weren't about battles, but about rivers, mountains, and ancestors who could track a deer for miles without leaving footprints. "My grandfather said the river teaches patience," he told them one night. "You can't rush it. You can only follow." Elsa sat in her bunk, pretending to sew, but her hands stilled at those words. For the first time, she wondered what patience might look like after war, what forgiveness might sound like in another language. Then, one humid evening, the conflict she'd feared finally arrived. A new transport of male prisoners came in, rough, angry men from captured U-boat crews. They jeered at the women, calling them names for working with the Americans. One of them threw a clod of mud at Elsa as she passed. She froze, humiliation burning her cheeks. Before she could react, Yazzie appeared behind her. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply picked up the clod from the ground, held it out to the man, and said in slow, careful English, "This belongs to the earth, not your anger." The soldier sneered but didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any punishment. When the guards dragged the man away, Elsa realized her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of witnessing dignity used as armor. That night, she found Yazzie sitting near the fence, repairing a wooden bucket. "Why didn't you hit him?" she asked, voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "Because water wears down stone, not the other way around." For a moment, the only sound was the drip of water from his bucket. Then she said softly, "You make it sound so easy." He looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. "It isn't. But it's the only way I know to stay human." She wanted to tell him that he'd already changed the camp, that the women whispered his name as though it were a prayer. But she couldn't find the words. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed him a scrap of cloth she'd embroidered that day, a small blue river stitched in crooked lines. "So you remember us," she said. He studied it, touched the threads, and then tucked it into his coat. "I'll remember," he said. "But not for me. For what comes after." The next morning, the first true rain of the season fell. It poured hard enough to wash the mud from the camp roads and fill Yazzie's trenches until they shimmered like mirrors. The prisoners stood at the windows, watching the water run, each drop blurring the world outside. Elsa pressed her palm to the glass, thinking of his words, "Rivers remember what people forget." She wondered what the world would remember of them, women who baked bread in captivity, who wept over soap, who learned mercy from a man whose ancestors had been conquered by the same nation that now called him guard. When the rain stopped, Yazzie was nowhere to be seen. Only the newly filled trenches remained, winding through the camp like silver veins, carrying reflections of sky and fence alike. And in that quiet, it became clear, he hadn't just brought them water. He'd brought them back a piece of themselves. The news came on a warm morning in May 1945. The war was over. The words drifted through the camp like the smell of rain after drought, unbelievable at first, then undeniable. Some prisoners cheered. Others stood silent, eyes hollow with the kind of relief that hurt more than hunger. The guards lowered their rifles, and for the first time, the fences felt thinner, almost imaginary. But for the women, the news carried a different weight. Freedom had a strange taste now, like cornbread gone cold, like coffee that had sat too long on the stove. Elsa was in the kitchen when she heard it. She had flour on her hands, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a strip of cloth once part of an American bedsheet. A cook ran in, shouting, "It's finished. Germany surrendered." The room erupted in motion, pots clanging, laughter mixing with tears. Yet Elsa didn't move. Her hands froze in the dough. She felt nothing like triumph, only the ache of something vast ending. She looked out the window and saw Yazzie walking along the fence, his posture steady as always, as though nothing in the world had changed. Later that day, an announcement came: the women would be repatriated. They would soon be put on trains heading east, across the ocean, back to the country that had once called them daughters and now might call them traitors. The camp suddenly buzzed with preparation. Packing, cleaning, inventory checks, but beneath the bustle lay a quiet grief. Leaving a prison should have felt like deliverance. Instead, it felt like abandoning a strange, fragile peace. Elsa found Yazzie repairing a water trough by the garden. "We're leaving," she said simply. He didn't look up. "Everyone leaves. Even rivers do." She swallowed hard. "What will you do now?" He paused, the sun catching on his hair. "Go home. There's work waiting. Fields. Family." Then, after a moment, "And ghosts." She nodded, unable to speak. The silence between them held all the things they hadn't said, the gratitude, the sorrow, the strange bond neither had sought but now couldn't name. That night, the women gathered one last time in the mess hall. They wore the clean dresses given by the Red Cross, stiff but new, smelling faintly of soap and starch. An American nurse played a hymn on an old piano, the notes trembling like candlelight. Someone brought out loaves of bread baked that afternoon, their crusts golden and warm. Elsa broke hers in half and passed it to the woman beside her. Across the room, Yazzie stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching quietly. When the song ended, the women rose one by one and began to approach him. Each carried something small, a letter, a button, a scrap of embroidery. Little offerings, tokens of memory. When Elsa reached him, she held out a bar of soap wrapped in paper. It was the same kind he'd given her that first winter. "For your river," she said softly. He smiled, that faint, unassuming curve of the mouth that seemed to hold both sorrow and peace. "You remembered." "How could I forget?" she whispered. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of wet soil and lilac. Trucks rumbled at the gate. The women climbed aboard, some weeping, some whispering prayers. Elsa found a seat near the window. The camp rolled past her eyes like a film reel. Fences, laundry lines, the mess hall chimney still breathing smoke. And then she saw him. Yazzie stood by the road, hand raised in quiet farewell. Not a salute, not command, just acknowledgement, one soul to another. As the truck pulled away, she pressed her palm to the glass, leaving a faint print of flour and dust. He grew smaller in the distance until he was only a dark figure against the rising sun. The women around her murmured about home, about parents, about what might be left. But Elsa said nothing. The smell of soap and bread clung to her like memory. Weeks later, they arrived in a shattered Germany. The streets were ruins, the air heavy with smoke and grief. When Elsa stepped off the transport, people stared at her strange uniform and clean dress. Children pointed. Someone shouted, "American woman!" She looked down at herself, fabric soft, color faded, but still smelling faintly of the camp, of soap, of America. In that moment, she understood what Yazzie had meant. Rivers never return unchanged. She had crossed one and come out different, cleaner, not in body but in heart. That night, in what was left of her hometown, she opened the small parcel he had once handed her. Inside, the bar of soap remained intact, pale yellow, edges smoothed by time. She placed it by her bedside and whispered, "You can't wash away all sorrow, but you can start with one small thing." Over the months that followed, the women tried to rebuild. They shared stories of the camp quietly, afraid to be mocked or accused. Yet in private, they remembered the strange gentleness they had known behind the wire, the bread, the laughter, the river. Elsa became known in her town for helping others wash and mend, for bringing clean clothes and warm meals to children left orphaned by war. When people asked why, she only said, "Because someone once did the same for me." Years later, an American journalist visited Bremen to write about post-war recovery. He found her in a courtyard surrounded by laundry lines and buckets of soapy water. When he asked what she remembered most from captivity, she smiled faintly. "The smell," she said. "It wasn't fear. It was bread, and soap, and something I can't describe, something like forgiveness." The journalist didn't understand. He wrote it down anyway. Before he left, Elsa brought out a small keepsake wrapped in cloth, the bar of soap, still unbroken. "This," she told him, "is the proof that kindness can survive anything, even victory." He asked her if she ever heard from the soldier who gave it to her. She shook her head. "No, but I think of him when it rains." That evening, as storm clouds gathered over Bremen, she placed the bar of soap on her windowsill. The first drops of rain began to fall, steady and clean, trailing paths down the glass. The scent of wet earth mixed with the faint trace of lemon that still lingered after all those years. In the reflection, she thought she saw a river running through the sky, silver, endless, moving always forward. Somewhere, she imagined, it reached faraway lands where cornfields grew and a quiet man with dark eyes watched the same rain fall on his own soil. And though neither would ever meet again, the river they shared kept flowing, through memory, through history, through every act of mercy born from the ruins of war. When the last of the rain faded, Elsa closed the window and breathed in deeply. The air smelled of bread, and soap, and America. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.